our childhood when my teacher would go in 5, 4, and the whole class would get quiet. Welcome to St. Andrews and to the final faith and offering of the season. The lecture series as it exists is a hope to present our daily life and with the intersection of our faith life, and to not make it be one that's just all about faith and some kind of denominational alignment, but that anybody who is on the journey of trying to understand God and how God intersects with our lives might grow. And so we've had 3 offerings this year, and Dr. Paul is our final one, and he is part of the Good Life method from Notre Dame University. And I've had the pleasure of getting to know him since 10:30 last night, when we had our 2-hour drive from RSW, and again over breakfast. And he has a wonderful story to share, and I hope lots for us to all learn and inquire about. And so I'm not going to say anything more except for welcome. It's good to have you here. Feel free to ask questions. I think he'll tell you that along the way. This isn't some kind of formal lecture where you're going to be spoken at. And finally, the bathrooms are next door if you need them, and sometimes that's a need. So feel free to get up and move about the cabin as you need. Okay? Dr. Paul?
All right, here we go. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I was telling some people that I was coming down here before I left. They were asking me what I was talking about, and I said, well, we're going to talk about the good life. And as it was snowing at the airport before I left, I sat there and I thought, what am I going to tell these people about the good life? So I really feel like I'm here researching as much as I'm here sharing. But we will talk a bit about some of the themes that we talk about in a class that I teach at Notre Dame called God and the Good Life. And I want to start by thinking for a second about how much of our lives we've now outsourced to technology. And it'll become clear here in a second why we're doing this. But so much of our reasoning, so much of our thinking today is done by machines. It's done by computers. These are wearable smart devices. They're like smartwatches. They literally tell you when to stand up. They say, you've been sitting too long. You need to stand up. You need to move. You need to walk, right? So much of the thinking that we used to do by ourselves, we've outsourced to technology. Now, one entry point into some of the philosophical views that we're going to consider is to ask the question whether there are certain things that we've just got to think through, reflect on, contemplate, and consider for ourselves. So one example of this might be the parent-child relationship. So a few years back, this product came out. It's called Aristotle, sort of ironically. And it's a smart baby monitor. And what this will do is it will monitor your child. You put the kid in the crib. If it starts crying, it'll start hushing it with white noise. If it asks it questions, it can answer those questions. It'll track all of their data, how often they've gone to the bathroom, all these kinds of things, right? And as soon as this product came out, there was pushback. There was some outrage. People thought, look, there are certain things that we can outsource to machines and technology, but some things you've just got to do yourselves, right? Now I say, I'm sympathetic to that view. I also have 4 children under the age of 6 right now, so sometimes I think, like, bring in the robots. Just bring them in, it's fine. Okay, so maybe parenting is like that. But what about other aspects of our lives, especially our intellectual and emotional lives? So I think it's clear. I don't think anybody in this room would download an app that could pray for you. Not one that helps you pray, right? There's a lot of great apps that help you pray. But one that could pray for you. You can just say, like, okay, start praying, and just like set your phone down. It says your prayers, and you're like, great, done, right? Something really bizarre about that. It doesn't seem like that's the right kind of activity to be outsourcing to technology. All right, so that's one of the things that we're going to think about today. And in particular, I want to think about whether reflecting on your life, contemplating the good things in your life, whether that's one of these activities that we've just got to do for ourselves, and how we can do that well. So to get into it, I'm going to give you a thought experiment. One of my favorite parts about philosophy is our methodology is literally just sitting and thinking and then talking to other people. We don't need like big machines. Like I don't have to wear a lab coat. Actually, sometimes I wish I could wear a lab coat. I feel like people would take me more seriously. But philosophy is great because we can all just do it wherever we are. So we're going to do some philosophy right now. And here's the thought experiment. So suppose there was an app. You could download it on your phone. It's called Guru. And it will take any question that you've got, any big picture moral question, any question about living a good life. It'll take that question, it'll compare it against data from thousands of users, and it'll spit out an answer. A couple of facts about Guru, which is a fictional device. A couple of facts about Guru. So one is, it is so powerful. It's got data from all different users. It's had experts who have crafted the algorithms, right? That it can tell you what to do, but it can't tell you why to do it, right? So if I say to Guru, should I go to graduate school right now, or should I have a family right now and just get a job? It'll take that question, it'll be boop, boop, doop, boop, boop. It'll be like, go to school, right? Okay, so first question, who here would use Guru to make all of their good life decisions, all of their big picture good life decisions? Interesting. Who would not use Guru? Everybody. Usually when I ask that in my class, there's like one freshman in the back be like, yeah, I'll do it. I don't care. I'm like, all right, that's my philosophy major. Interesting. So the question is, why not? What is it about reflecting on these things that's so important for us to do? And what I want you to do, I'm so glad that you warned them, this is going to be interactive. I want you to chat with a neighbor for just a second. Why wouldn't you use Guru? Why not use Guru to make these decisions? So chat for a second, and then I'll ask a few of you to share, and then we're going to look at what Aristotle would say about this. So just chat for 1 second. Why not use Guru? All right, we'll take 10 more seconds. Finish the thought you're on. All right, you guys are wonderful. All right, so I'm gonna see if there's just 1, 2, or 3 people who'd like to share their answer. Why not use Guru? What would be so bad about it? Yeah. Yeah, good. So you want to be in charge. Yep, so the response is that you want to be in charge of the decisions that you're making in your life. And I can see a couple of different aspects of that, right? So one is you want to be the one that made the decision, right? I think we would all think it would be weird if there was somebody who always looked to another person to make a decision. And maybe this is actually the case for some people, right? I used to do this in college. I'd be like, I got a big decision coming up. I'd just be like, Mom, what do I do, right? If I was still every decision going to one person, that'd be weird, right? I'm not sort of in control. I'm not making the decision. I think also the ownership that you get from the decisions that you make. Imagine you made a big picture decision. You've got 2 people. You could marry one of them. And you're like, you ask guru, and then you go with this person. Now imagine the person you didn't choose says, well, why didn't you choose me? You're gonna say like, my phone told me not to. Like, that's a terrible answer, right? Yeah, wonderful. Maybe one more. Why not use guru? Yeah. Doesn't take into account our feelings and our experiences. I love that answer. That is a very Aristotelian answer. That is very, very smart. Yeah, look at that. Yeah, that's right. He gets an A. You guys both get A's. Everybody in the back gets an A. That's right. So much of the decision making that we engage in, it goes so far beyond mere calculations, right? So you might be skeptical that guru can even do that sort of work, right? You've got to be attuned in the right sort of way. If your kid comes to you, sorry, all my examples are going to be parenting examples, and they say, can I do this activity? You've got to sort of feel it out, right? You've got to say like, I don't know, this might be really good for them. It doesn't just come down to like, okay, how much does it cost? Or like, how much joy would this produce? It's sort of an attunement process. Man, you guys know a lot. Okay. So one thing that we're going to do today is we're going to walk through what I call the good life method. And it's kind of a spoiler. It's really just Aristotle's virtue ethics. So we kind of just stole the ideas and added to them. But we're going to walk through that. And so at the end of that section, you're going to be able to explain why Aristotle would recommend that we don't use guru. And that's going to be part of the answer. Actually, both of these are going to be part of the answer. First, though, I want to just introduce myself a little bit. This is me. Here's Notre Dame. Here's the book that this comes from. And the book is based on a class, like I mentioned, that we teach at Notre Dame called God and the Good Life. And in that class, we ask really big picture questions, like what would it take for your life to be meaningful? Should you practice a religion? What do you owe to yourself and other people? And I walked through this with 150 freshmen per section per semester, and we're all dialoguing about these really big questions. I'm super lucky. This is like the best job in the whole world, at least for me. And so I'll mention a little bit more about the class, but especially toward the end when we kind of open it up for more discussion, if you've got questions about that class, I totally want to invite those questions. We talked about Job on Monday and the problem of evil and suffering in the world. We talked about arguments for God's existence last week. So I'll open it up eventually and we can talk about any of those things. I also want to introduce some heroes in my life. Yeah, they're cute. So this is my family. This is my wife, Shayla. She's the biggest hero. She is right now back in Indiana where it is snowing with the 4 kids. And then this is Solomon, Maria, Lydia, and then Benedict, who's 9 months old. I just like showing that picture. Okay. So here are 3 key claims that we're going to talk about with respect to virtue ethics. If you can't see them, I know it's kind of small up here. Don't worry, I'll read them out. But here are 3 key claims that we're going to focus on that I'm going to sort of lead us through some dialogue about. The first one is that for Aristotle, living a good life requires us to engage in moral reasoning, which is a skill that's embodied in practical wisdom. So we'll talk especially about this idea of wisdom toward the end of this talk. But for Aristotle, learning how to live well, learning how to live a good life, is something that requires this kind of reflective contemplation, the pursuit of wisdom. In fact, philosophy, some fun trivia for you, is actually the etymology of philosophy is philos and sophia, which is the love of wisdom. So if you love wisdom, congratulations, you're a philosopher. The second claim that we'll talk about is that you acquire this skill by achieving virtues in order to achieve the ultimate aim of human life, which for Aristotle is happiness. And that's going to require some unpacking, because happiness for Aristotle is not what we typically think about as happiness. Like today, I was incredibly happy. I saw one of those tiny iguanas, and I was like, ooh. And I had this feeling. Aristotle thinks that's good, that feeling is good, but that's not what real happiness is. That's not deep happiness. So we'll talk a bit more about what he thinks happiness is. And then finally, I want to talk about the deepest form of happiness for Aristotle, which is contemplative activity that engages your virtues. And this is the part that I really enjoy talking to my students about. It's the part that we don't often think about really in the contemporary world, right? What is contemplation? What does that require of us? And why does Aristotle think that's necessary in order to be truly and deeply happy? All right, so we're going to start at the very beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics. Here's a quote. So Aristotle starts this text by saying, every art and every inquiry, and similarly every pursuit, is thought to aim at some good. If then, there's some end of the things we do, and if we don't choose everything for the sake of something else, clearly this must be the good and the chief good. Hey, it's complicated. I'm not even reading it in Greek. All right. Every art, every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit is thought to aim at some good. Anybody have an interpretation of this for us? Every art, every inquiry, similarly every action and pursuit is thought to aim at some good. What do you think Aristotle means by that? Yeah.
You should have a goal in mind.
Yeah.
Have something to aim for that is good.
That is good. Aristotle thinks anytime you do something, anytime you act, you've got a goal, and it should be a goal that's good. And in fact, it's going to be a goal that seems good to you, no matter what you're doing, right? So if I go and take a drink of water, there's a reason, there's a purpose, there's a goal, right? It's to quench my thirst. That's easy, all right? If I enroll in a graduate program, this is a very terrible example, there's some goal that I have. Let's say it's education. That's a good thing, right? Everything that you do has some goal associated with it. It's always something that you think is good. All right, now Aristotle takes that, makes it even more complicated. If then there's some end of the things that we do, and if we don't choose everything for the sake of something else, this must be the good and the chief good. Okay, so Aristotle's saying here, not only is everything aiming at some good, there's got to be one good thing, one ultimate goal, one ultimate aim that we're all striving for in life. What could that possibly be? What could that possibly be? Yeah.
What about people that plot and plan to do evil?
Yeah, good. This is a great question. So the question is, what about people that plot and plan to do evil and they act on those motivations, right? So even there, Aristotle is going to say, they've got some goal in mind that seems good to them. They might be wrong about that, but they think it's going to be good, right? So if I'm plotting to rob a bank, it would be great if I had lots more money than I have now, right? So there's some aspect of that that is good, right? It's a great question. And it's controversial. Not everybody agrees with Aristotle here. All right. So to understand what Aristotle thinks the ultimate aim of human life is, we've got to make a quick distinction. There are two types of good things that we could be aiming at. One of those are what we can call instrumental goods, and the classic example here is money. Money is good because it gets you something else, right? So if I told you, sir, George, if I said, George, I will give you $10,000 right now if you want it, but you can't spend it on anything. And I'm not even going to give you the cash, and you can't tell anybody about it. I'm going to deposit it in an account you'll never see, and you'll never get any interest on it. What would you say? Yeah, right? No, why would you do that, right? You can't even use the cash to build a chair. Nothing, right? Money is only good because it gets us something else. This is a classic example of an instrumental good. Then there are what Aristotle calls final goods, things that are good for their own sake. So my example here is family or relationships. You don't just have relationships or friendships with people because you want to get something else, right? There is that aspect. If I'm good friends with somebody who's smarter than me, then I can study with them and they can help me out. But if you were friends with somebody just because you wanted something, that would be kind of wrong, right? All right, so there's these two kinds of goals. Now, Aristotle says, whatever the greatest good is, whatever the ultimate good is in human life, it's got to be purely a final good and not an instrumental good. So he thinks, okay, let's think about things like money. Money is only instrumental. This is not the ultimate aim of human life. What about things that are both instrumentally valuable, also intrinsically valuable, or good in and of themselves? My example here is poetry. When I read poetry, I read it in part because it's relaxing. Like, it's really enjoyable. I like reading poetry. But I also read it because it's just good in and of itself, right? Even if I found a poem that didn't relax me, it would still be good to read. Okay, so there are goods in that category. And then Aristotle says there are goods that we only want for their own sake. Now, he claims that happiness is the only good of this kind. And here's one way of thinking about it. So, if I asked you, remind me of your name, Don. If I asked Don, if I said, why are you here right now, Don? You might say, to learn. And I'd say, like, why do you want to learn, Don? Because you enjoy it, right? And I say, well, why do you enjoy it, right? If I kept asking Don questions, eventually we'd get to a point where he might say, well, because that's what makes me happy. And whenever you get to that point, Aristotle thinks, the explanation is done. You can't keep asking the why question. So I do this with my undergrads. I say, why are you in class? And they say, well, I need to take this class. And I say, why? And they say, I want to get a degree. And I say, why? And they say, I want to get a job. And I say, why? And they say, I want money. And I say, why? And they say, because I want to buy a house. And I'm like, why, right? At this point, they're all like, I don't know if I want to take this class anymore. But eventually, they say, because I want to be happy. Aristotle thinks if you get to that point, there is no more explanation. And interestingly, Aristotle thinks for anything that you want, it's ultimately going to be explained by your desire or your goal to achieve happiness. So everything that we do is ultimately aiming at this goal, to be happy. And we can do some informal polling to see if he's right. Who here wants to be happy? Raise your hand if you want to be happy. That's everyone. Again, usually the same person in the back is like, no, I don't care. And you're like, you do care. You do care. Everybody wants to be happy. That's a remarkable fact, right? That we all have this goal in common. There's probably nothing else, no other goal that we could identify that we all agree on like that. This is some evidence that Aristotle's onto something here. Okay, but if that's right, then the next question, the crucial question, is what is happiness? And Aristotle says, if you know what happiness is, then like an archer who can see the target, you are going to be more likely to be able to hit it. But if you don't know what happiness is, you're going to be stumbling around in the dark. So you've got to figure out, what is happiness? Okay, so I'm going to go through one theory that I think is not true. I'm going to try to convince you that it's not true. And then I'll go through the theory that I think is true. So when I was a kid, I loved ice cream. Actually, I still love ice cream. But every morning I would wake up and I'd just be like, maybe it's ice cream day. My parents would be like, what do you want for breakfast? I was like, I don't know, maybe ice cream? Is that like a thing of ice cream? Like every day, all I wanted was ice cream, right? And I wanted it because it made me feel amazing. And we all have things like this, right? Now, actually, for me, it's coffee. It's like every day. It's just like you take that sip of coffee and you're just like, it's just amazing, right? You have this feeling. Or it's even like seeing a friend, a good friend that you love, right? You get this feeling. You have this emotional attachment to them. There's a school of thought and philosophy that says that is what happiness is. We're going to give it a fancy name here. I know you cannot read this in the back. Don't worry. I'll read it out for you. The fancy name we'll give it is hedonism. And this is a term that gets used in many different ways, but in philosophy, this is our official name for it, hedonism. It's the idea that happiness is pleasure, right? It's subjective well-being, and that as the ultimate goal, it should be what all of our decisions ultimately aim at. You might think, this is plausible, you might think this sounds crazy, but there are philosophers, especially contemporary philosophers, who are very committed to this idea. So here's two philosophers. John Stuart Mill wrote Utilitarianism, and he says everything that we do ultimately aims to either alleviate suffering or promote pleasure of some sort. And it's not a crazy view, right? It wouldn't be a simple kind of pleasure. It wouldn't be the kind of hedonism that as a kid I was embodying, right? Because there are different kinds of pleasure. There's pleasures of friendship or pleasures of listening to beautiful music. There's all kinds of different things. So you can make it a very complex view. Another thinker who holds this view is Martin Seligman. He's a positive psychologist, right? And he defines happiness as subjective well-being. So if I asked you, like, how are you? Like, how are you doing? 1 to 5. Like, whatever number you give me, that represents your subjective well-being, right? Seligman Mill think that's what happiness consists in. Okay, but I disagree with them, and I'm going to try to convince you that you should too. And here's how we'll do it. So I'm going to give you a thought experiment, another thought experiment. Suppose that there was a machine. It's called the experience machine. And here's how it works. You can enter into this machine, and you can program it so that you can have any experiences that you want, right? If you want to have the experience of just like going to the moon, you plug into the machine, and it gives you the experience. You can't tell that you're not actually having that experience, right? And how it works is if you plug into the machine, you've got to remain there for the rest of your life, but you can program it to do whatever you want. If you want to write a great novel, you just plug it in. You say, okay, I want to write a great novel. I'll have that experience. And you might think like, well, it can't be super easy because there's got to be struggle in life. Great. Okay, so say like, I want to write a great novel after a lot of struggle. You can have those experiences. Who would plug into the experience machine? Interesting. Question is, why not? So like Guru, I want you to chat for just 73 seconds. I want you to chat about why not. What would you be missing out on if you plugged into the machine? Chat with a neighbor, and we'll get 2 or 3 views out there, and we'll go from there. All right. I see great conversations. Finish the thought you're on. All right, so let's get a couple of thoughts out there. Why not plug into the experience machine? Yeah. You wouldn't have any surprises or unexpected experiences. That's phenomenal, right? So you can dictate it. You can plug in whatever you want. But I think it's super interesting how many times the things we value most or find most meaningful are things that we could not have predicted, right? 10 years ago, if you asked me what my life is going to look like, I would not have predicted this to be my life, right? Like, look where I am, right? Like, this is amazing, right? That's great. That's excellent. Yeah.
I said to Edie, my gosh, if I plugged into the machine, I would have had this wonderful opportunity to sit and have a conversation with Edie.
Yeah. But you would have had the opportunity to feel like you had had a conversation with Edie. Okay. So there's something, so the thought is you wouldn't have had this conversation, you wouldn't have had this connection with somebody else, and even though you wouldn't know that you weren't actually having this connection with somebody else, it still seems to you like there's something better about the fact that you're actually connecting with another person. That's so interesting. There's an identical experience, but one of them is more valuable. One of them is better. Yeah, there's somebody in the back. Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of thoughts on this. So the response here is, where's free will, right? If you plug into the machine, it seems like everything from that moment forward is determined, right? And I don't know about you guys, but I don't trust my past self of 10 minutes ago to make a decision for me now, right? So you would have freedom at the very beginning, but then you're locked in. Everything is totally determined. And it seems like a life without freedom, a life without free will would not be a good life. It also seems like it could detach you in the same way that we would all be detached from Edie. That would be the worst world, Edie. You seem wonderful. In the same way we'd be detached from Edie, we would also be detached from God, right? So it seems like anybody who thinks there's a really important relationship, spiritual relationship, with God that you should have, seems like that's a great reason not to get into the machine. Yeah?
I think when you brought it up, I thought of the movie Matrix.
Yeah.
You know, we might be plugged in and not know it.
Yeah, right. So in the Matrix, oh no, okay. We're not gonna go all the way down the rabbit hole, but we're gonna start. The movie The Matrix, if you've seen The Matrix or Inception, this is a somewhat common science fictional thought experiment, right? And they like to make movies like this. And the interesting thing here is you wouldn't know, right? There is some sort of intellectual limit. You wouldn't actually know the difference. I'll just mention, I don't know, this is embarrassing for my discipline, but there's a non-negligible number of philosophers arguing today that we're actually in the Matrix. And the reason that they argue that is they say, there's no evidence that you could possibly come up with that we're not in the Matrix, right? And they think there's some evidence that computers nowadays are getting so powerful that within 10, 20, 50 years, we'll be able to generate subjective experiences. And so they say, like, okay, we have some evidence that we are in the Matrix, no evidence we're not in the Matrix, we're probably in the Matrix. They're crazy, but anyway, so that's philosophy. Okay, yeah. Yeah, say more. So in saying, isn't that what they're supposed to do, is the thought, one thought with psychedelic drugs is that we can kind of engineer or cause certain kinds of experiences, and really deep spiritual experiences. And so maybe one thought is, instead of the experience machine, we could just use like psilocybin or something, right? That's maybe a real life example of this thought experiment. Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy, yeah. Okay, awesome. Man, you guys are just so smart. I'm gonna give you all honorary degrees. I can't do that. I cannot do that. I actually can't do that. All right. So here's the argument. You all have helped me make it here. If happiness is nothing more than a subjective experience of well-being, then anybody who wants to be happy should just plug into the experience machine. But you definitely should not plug into the experience machine. So that means that happiness is something other than just a purely subjective experience of well-being, right? So here's an argument against this view that we've been calling hedonism, that happiness is not just this feeling, this subjective feeling that we get. So what is happiness? Here's how Aristotle defines it. He calls it eudaimonia. This is the only Greek word that I'll use. But now you all know this Greek word. Look at this. Eudaimonia. You can impress your friends. Eudaimonia's definition is human flourishing. It's used to describe a life that's characterized by excellence, fulfillment of one's purpose, and deep contentment. So Aristotle says, instead of just calling it happiness in general, this kind of emotional feeling that we get, I'm going to give it a new term, eudaimonia. This is deep happiness. So what does that consist in? In order to understand it, we're going to have to take a brief detour. It's very brief, I promise. So here's where we'll start. So everything that exists, Aristotle thinks, has a function. The function is the purpose of that thing. It's what it's supposed to do, right? So a knife has a function. What's the function of a knife? To cut things. Brilliant. Once you define the function of a thing, you can also define what makes that thing excellent. So if the function of a knife is to cut things, an excellent knife cuts things well. And you can define features that make knives good knives, right? So what's one feature that makes a knife good? Sharpness, brilliant. Heftiness, I don't know. Having a handle. A knife without a handle, totally useless, right? You can define what makes it excellent. Aristotle thinks those properties, those excellences, those are virtues. That's what we call virtues. Virtues are functional excellences. And it's just like inanimate objects, like knives have functions and virtues, so too do living beings and creatures, right? Function of a dog is to survive, to flourish, to reproduce, to fetch. If you have a dog and you throw a ball and it's just like, yeah, I don't care, it's a bad dog. You know that because that's part of its function, right? So Aristotle thinks virtues are features that allow an object to perform its function excellently. So if we want to know what our virtues are, what our aim is, what happiness consists in for us, we need to know what our function is. How do we figure that out? So for Aristotle, the function of a thing distinguishes it from all other kinds of things. So if we want to know what our function is, we've got to figure out what is it that separates us from all other things. You might think, I don't know, we eat. Nope, all animals eat. Okay. We feel pain. Nope, a lot of animals feel pain as well, right? What could it be? Aristotle says, we use reason. We use reason, right? We're able to engage in this kind of intellectual activity. And so he defines our function as an activity of soul which follows or implies a rational principle. So what makes us excellent human beings is if we use our mind and our soul in the right sort of way. Okay, so here's another bit of the Nicomachean Ethics. We're going to go from our function to this claim that we ultimately want to be happy. Again, I know you can't read that, don't worry. I'm reading it right now. Here we go. It says, if the function of man is an activity in soul, of soul, which follows or implies a rational principle, if we say that some object and a good object of that kind have a function which is the same in kind, then if any action is well performed when it's performed in accordance with the appropriate excellence, the human good turns out to be the activity of soul in accord with virtue. And if there's more than one virtue, in accord with the best and most complete, in a complete life. So for Aristotle, if our function is this rational principle, then the best activity that we can engage in is activity of soul in accord with reason when we possess all of the virtues. Thinks that is contemplation. Definitely going to have to say a lot more about that. So here we go. All right. So for Aristotle, deep happiness, what he describes as deep happiness, eudaimonia, the activity of reason, wisdom, and contemplation in accord with all the human virtues in the context of a complete life. So we're going to talk about contemplation, what it actually looks like in just a second. Before we get there, I just want to check in. Given this definition, given what you know of Aristotle now, why do you think Aristotle would say that you shouldn't use guru?
There's
There's no contemplation, right? Good. You can't get guru to contemplate for you. And in fact, if you use guru over and over, you're not going to develop the skills and virtues that you need in order to contemplate. Right? Like one of those skills, one of those virtues, is being able to be bored, right? Patience. Patience is a virtue. People say this, right? Patience is a virtue. If whenever I have a problem, I'm just like, guru, what is it? Done. I will never gain the virtue of patience. And if I don't have patience, then I'm definitely not going to be able to contemplate, right? What else? Why else would Aristotle say, don't use guru? True, guru has no soul. And it's sort of leaving your soul less developed in a way, right? So in the same way that if I'm always asking my mom, like, what to do in life, I'm not growing and developing as a person. The same way, you're not developing, you're not crafting your soul, those virtues. Yeah. By the way, as I was putting this together, I was showing this to some of my friends in the philosophy department. They're like, why are you using guru as an example? That already exists. It's called ChatGPT. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but it's an AI machine, and it is just going to destroy education. No, not really. We'll figure out ways around it, but it's going to change education massively. But it's pretty incredible. Okay. All right. So I promise I'll only talk for about 10 more minutes, and then we're going to open it up and have questions, dialogue, etc. But we got to talk about contemplation and what this is, right? Okay, so if you want to live a good human life, Aristotle thinks there are at least 3 different essential kinds of activities that you're going to have to engage in, right? So Aristotle distinguishes between work, leisure, and contemplation. So the way that we're going to get to contemplation is we're going to kind of rule out other activities in our life that fulfill other functions, right? Okay, so what is work? For Aristotle, work is just productive activity, right? If I'm making a bowl, and then I have made the bowl, and then I sell it to somebody, I've created a product, and then I've sold it, I've provided some sort of instrumental good, money, that fulfills my needs. Leisure is productive activity that's engaged in for its own sake. Productive activity that's engaged in for its own sake. So for Aristotle, if I created the bowl, and then somebody was like, oh, that's a great bowl, I'll buy it from you for $50. And I was just like, nah, that's not why I make it. I just make this. That's the only reason that I'll do it, right? Engaging in productive activity for its own sake, that for Aristotle is leisure. Now, interestingly, and this is a point that a lot of my students find surprising, is that we tend not to engage in much of what Aristotle would call leisure in our culture, right? Especially my students. So much of what they do is for some other end, and I totally get it. They're studying because they got to get degrees. They're joining clubs in part because they got to put that on their resume. They're so busy, right, that so much of the leisure has just sort of dropped out, fallen out of their lives. Okay, and then there's what Aristotle calls contemplation. So what does this actually look like? I think I'm going to skip the next slide because it's a fourfold Greek distinction of different types of activity. So we're gonna skip through that. We'll come back. Don't worry. We'll come back. To understand what we mean by contemplation, and especially philosophical contemplation, I'm going to introduce another thinker, another virtue ethicist. So some of you may have heard of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor in the 2nd century. He ruled through a pandemic and through a war. He trained in all of the schools of virtue ethics that were popular at the time. And he was committed to a view called Stoicism. Has anybody heard of Stoicism before? I think we've all heard the term, and you may have even seen it. It's kind of coming back. It's getting popular again. A lot of people are talking about Stoicism. Stoicism is this idea that the most important things in life, the most valuable things in life, are internal. They're things that can't be taken away from you. So for the Stoic, Marcus Aurelius was looking around. He's this emperor. He sees all of these people that are so unhappy. And he's saying, why are they so unhappy? They have so many things, right? And for Marcus Aurelius, a lot of our unhappiness comes from an attachment to external goods, things that can be taken away. So the answer for the Stoic is to only be attached to things that can't be taken away. Mostly, that's just virtue. So for Marcus Aurelius, if you've got virtue, no matter what else happens to you, your happiness can't be threatened. So his philosophy is captured in this notebook that he kept at the time. And in the notebook, he would write down meditations or aphorisms. They would be things like, if you lose a ship, because, that was the time. It was like, ships were a big deal. He's like, if you lose a ship, just remember to yourself that you still have your life, right? We would say, suppose you lose all of your income, all of your money. Don't forget, you still have relationships with people that you love. And love is not something that the economy can take away. It's not something that can sink in the ocean, right? Love is something you can always introspect and meditate on. So for Marcus Aurelius, philosophical contemplation, philosophical meditation, involves this inward look. And to illustrate the importance of this, I want to bring up an example from another philosopher, Kieran Satia. So he wrote a book, it's a really wonderful book, it's called Midlife. And in this book, he describes how everything that he did in his life, up until a certain point, it was always aiming at something else. So he says, look, I thought to myself, if I just get my undergraduate degree, then I can get into grad school. He thinks, if I get into grad school, my life's going to be awesome. And then he gets into grad school, and he's like, it's kind of okay. He's like, but if I get my PhD, then I can get a job, and then that's going to be amazing. And he gets the job, and he's like, It's like, if I earn $500,000, I'll be able to buy a house for my family, and I'm going to be happy. It's going to be amazing. And then he gets it, and he's like, Every time he achieves one of these goals, he thinks, there's something else. There's something missing, right? So he tries to diagnose this problem. In the book, he says the problem is that he was focused only on these goods that are what he calls telic goods. Goods that have a goal outside of themselves. This is a common phenomenon. Psychologists have even researched this, right? They call it the hedonic treadmill. As soon as you get a thing that you think you wanted, you realize, that's fine, but I want something else, right? There is no thing outside of yourself that you can get and just be like, boom, happy forever, done, right? It's always changing. You're always adjusting. You're getting used to it. You're always chasing something else. And Satia says, in his life, he realized there was nothing that didn't have that kind of structure. He was always looking at the next thing. And so he started to take walks for no reason. And it wasn't like he was walking fast because he's like, I'm going to get to the university and start working or something like that. He was just taking walks. So he started doing yoga. And not just to get fit, but because he just wanted to engage in that activity. Started writing poetry, right? These kinds of goods are what he calls atelic goods. Goods that, like Aristotle tells us, have their end or their goal internal to themselves. You engage in them just because engaging in that activity is good in and of itself. And there's a wholeness and a completeness to that kind of activity. So the way I relate to this is when I'm holding Benny. Benny is the 9-month-old, and he's in the 99.5 percentile in height, weight, and everything. He is just super chubby. He's just weird, this little guy, right? I'm holding him, and I am just so immersed and absorbed. And it's not like I'm sitting there thinking how long do I have to keep holding him? It's not like I'm thinking man, if they invented something else that held him, I wouldn't have to do this. The activity itself is complete and absorbing and enjoyable. Aristotle thinks contemplation is an activity like this. And it gets really mysterious. This is sort of a bait and switch. Aristotle talks throughout the Nicomachean Ethics about contemplation. He says it's the highest good, it's the deepest form of happiness. He gets to the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, and he's like, and it's kind of mysterious, I don't know how it works. He says, it's an activity that gets us as close as we can get to the gods. Aristotle believed in gods. It is a divine activity that activates what is divine in us, and it's something that we can't fully comprehend. And then Thomas Aquinas comes around, and he's like, that's because contemplation is worship. Contemplation is prayer. Contemplation is this activity that you engage in when you are open to and attuned to the wonder of reality to the immensity of God, and you can just sit with it. So here's where, in the class and in my philosophy, sort of get off the Aristotle train. I'm like, thank you, sir. And I jump on the Thomas Aquinas train. I'm like, here we go. Because Aquinas thinks there's a lot that we can know about contemplation and how to do it. He thinks it all has to do with this sort of spiritual connection, this understanding of how we relate to God. All right. I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to give us a second to think, because we have just talked about a lot of stuff. You guys, this was like half of the semester. Like, if you were at Notre Dame, like, this is like midterms time right now, right? We just did a lot of thinking. So I'm going to pause for a second. I'm going to give you a second to think about what we've talked about and any of the issues, questions that have arisen, or about any questions you have outside of what we've talked about the class or about Aquinas, anything like that. And then we'll open it up and we can dialogue about it for a bit. So I'll give you a second to think. I like to do this with my students too, because otherwise it's like, quick, think of a question, like ask it. So take a second to think about it. I believe we've got until 5:15. Think so. We're roughly thereabouts. So we've got plenty of time.
Is that okay to go till 5:15? If you need to, leave, feel free. Otherwise, we're going to hang in there till 5:15.
Okay, great. Or we can do 5, whatever. It'll be very relaxed. All right. But are there any questions? Anybody want to share anything? Questions? Yeah.
What's the definition of contemplation? Centering prayer,
Yeah.
meditation, and all kinds of different stuff.
Yeah. So the question is, what's my definition of contemplation? And examples that you're bringing up, centering prayer, meditation, mindfulness. So first I'd say I think all of those are contemplative or contemplation-like activities. That seems right to me. I tend to follow Aquinas, and in particular, Joseph Pieper has a definition of contemplation that he's using Aquinas to draw on. Let me think of how I would say it very sort of quickly, or like sort of in a thought or sentence. Contemplation is a reflective awareness of those good things in your life that your experience and virtue has put you in a position to appreciate. Contemplation is a reflective awareness of the good things in your life that your experience and virtues have put you in a position to appreciate. So for me, when I sit down at night, I usually do the Jesuit examen, the examen prayer. So I go through the day and I like distinguish between moments that were consoling and moments that were desolating, and then I discern sort of the spirit throughout those things. In that activity, I'm becoming aware of the good things in my life, especially those good experiences, that experience and virtue puts me in a position to appreciate. But I also think just being with Benny can be kind of contemplative. Just like holding the little dude and just like being present to the goodness and connecting. I think that's a contemplative activity. I think prayer can be contemplative. Liturgy and worship. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, good. So the question is contemplation gratitude? And I think certainly gratitude is part of it. It's interesting to think about what part of it is, right? Sorry, this is going to get kind of philosophical. because this is what we do. We're like, ooh, interesting. All right, theory. So one thing I would say is it can't be mere gratitude, because there's a lot of different things that gratitude could get us, or a lot of different reasons to engage in gratitude. So one of the things that I'll sometimes do is I'll gratitude journal. And sometimes I only do gratitude journaling just because I know that that makes me a better person, like less angry. And so it's an instrumental activity. Like I'll sit down in the morning, I'll just be like, oh, I'm grateful for my family and like whatever, you know. And then I do that and I'm like, okay, good, all right. But really there I'm using gratitude kind of like I use exercise, right? Like I just want to be a little bit less stiff, you know? And so there, I'm really using it as an instrumental activity. I just want something else, so I'm going to use it. And it seems like that's okay. It seems like that's fine. But there are other times where gratitude is spontaneous and reflects an awareness of some beauty or goodness for its own sake, right? Like I saw mountains the other day, and I was just like, you know? Like just, it was this experience of just like the immensity of the world and this joy and this gratitude. I think that is certainly a contemplative sort of experience or activity. So if you're engaging in gratitude in that way, and I think it's hard to imagine a contemplative activity that you're not feeling gratitude as part of or in. So I certainly think gratitude plays a huge role in it. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm listening to you.
Yeah.
Your use of the word happiness.
Mhm.
How do you compare that with the word joy?
I love that question. I mean, one boring thing to say, and as a philosopher, we often do this. We're like, well, we can use words however we want, right? And so okay. The other thing you can do, and philosophers often do this, is they say, well, let's look at how people use the terms and try to map out the concepts, right? Or the other thing you can do is say like, okay, no, let's focus on just these two things, happiness and joy, and kind of compare. So let's do the third of those things, because that's, I think, the more interesting thing. So, to me, joy is it's a kind of spontaneous response to something, and it's something that the happy person is characteristically going to feel, right? Like if you're happy, you're probably going to be joyful. So it seems like joy is almost more fundamental than happiness, right? And it seems like you might experience joy even if you're not overall in your life happy, right? And maybe they come apart from one another, right? Maybe you could be just deeply unhappy for some reason, but still have some deep joy in an experience or in a moment, right? But it seems like joy is this kind of spontaneous enjoyment of the good things that would make you happy overall in your life, right? So it seems like they're very closely related. Yeah. Let's see, Jim? Yeah. Okay, and then we'll go this way. Yeah.
Just wondering if eudaimonia is the sort of ultimate state and that, then how does that relate to or interplay with contemplation?
Yeah. So, for Aristotle, eudaimonia is going to be the way that we characterize a person's life as a whole who's achieved these virtues, and contemplation is the activity that they characteristically engage in, right? So you are going to be eudaimon. If you've got the virtues, you know how to contemplate, you're right there, and then you're going to be drawn to contemplate, right?
Does that make contemplation instrumental?
It's a great question. Because it seems like a lot of contemplative activities are things we can instrumentalize. I have an app on my phone, the Calm app, right? And it's meditation and mindfulness. And I'm always instrumentalizing it, right? I'm just like, oh, I need to chill out. And I'll like listen to it and I'll be like, meh. Okay. For Aristotle, if I'm engaging in that activity in that way, then that shows me it's not contemplative. It's not a contemplative way of engaging in it. And it's interesting because it can be one of the same kind of activity or action, right? But there are a lot of things like this. Like if I had a ball right here and I just went like, boom, and like went through that door, that's like nothing. If I did that, boom, but we said like that door is the goal, it's like I'm playing soccer, right? It's like this action, boom, like it's the same action. It counts as playing soccer if the context is right and if my motivations are right, if I'm following the rules. And it doesn't count as soccer if we're just not on a soccer field, right? So for Aristotle, this contemplative activity, you could be doing one and the same thing, but depending on your motivations, your reasons for doing it, and how you're engaging it, how you're approaching it, it could be contemplative in one instance and not contemplative in another. And so that might be, that is a big challenge, right? I was in the Catholic seminary for a while, and we would have a holy hour every day at like 6 a.m. And you'd go and you'd pray, right? And one of the difficult things about that is like you're engaging in this prayer, and you would constantly be tempted to be like, okay, I'm just gonna like check off all the prayers, get them done, right? You're like, come on, right? And you think about it and you're like, okay, you know. It's hard, right? It's hard to engage in an activity in a contemplative sort of way. So I think that's a big challenge. Yeah.
How does Holy Spirit weave into some of the things that we're all in a blessing from?
Absolutely. How does the Holy Spirit weave into this? This is where I say, Mother Michelle is right there. You're talking about theology, man. But I'll give like a philosopher's take on it. Okay, so for Aristotle, this is kind of nuts. But for Aristotle and a lot of Greek virtue ethicists, a lot of ancient philosophers, they used to have this term. It's called nous. And nous is this activity of reason that they think is universally shared. And not just reason, I should say, it's this way of engaging with the world that is universally shared. It's sort of like breath or spirit. And it is a thing that makes us distinctively human, right? And as you're reading through some of these things, and certainly as like somebody like Thomas Aquinas is reading through some of these things, he's like, oh, that's just the Holy Spirit. Like they were just talking about the Holy Spirit there, right? So certainly to get to like a theologically rich conception of the role of the Holy Spirit in contemplation, we're going to need a lot of theology. And that's where I don't get paid enough, man. Like the theologians get like 20,000 more a year than me for this reason, right? So we're going to need a lot of theology. But I will say, just to take Aquinas as an example, or Ignatius, or really a lot of the saints that I'm familiar with are going to say that contemplation is something that you don't do alone. You don't do it on your own. It is something that requires a lot of you. You've got to practice. You've got to acquire virtues. You've got to be in the right sort of mindset. But it's like once you're there is a movement. And I think, we can even experience, like in our own experience, we see this. You're sort of there, and then there's a joy or a gratitude or an uplifting that I think in this framework you would want to say, oh, that's going to be the role of the Holy Spirit. Or, yeah.
So we live in a world where instead of engaging in contemplation, we engage in filling quiet space. Because contemplation, it can happen in noise, but often happens in quiet. And we're not comfortable with quiet. So how do your students understand the privacy of something like that reflective contemplation?
Yeah. It's a
It's a reflective way of thinking.
great question. So I would say, I teach a class on the philosophy of work, and the whole point of that entire class is to get us to a point where we realize that there's a distinctive activity, there's a way of engaging with the world that we've completely lost sight of, right? And that there's really good reasons why it doesn't naturally arise in our everyday lives. And so when I talk about the contemplative life with my students, or even leisure, one of the activities I'll have them do is I'll have them put their phones and laptops in their bags, and then I'll give them a series of prompts, so a series of questions, and I'll say, okay, walk somewhere on campus, don't have your phone, you don't have your laptop, and I just want you to be profoundly bored. And I want you to find some object. It could be at the grotto, it could be in the basilica, it could just be a tree, and just become attuned to that thing, right? And that's what the prompts are for. And the students come back and they report that at first, when they engage in this kind of activity, it's really, really uncomfortable. And I do it too, and I find the same thing, right? I start walking on campus, and I'm just like feeling my pocket. For some reason, I just do that. I'm just like, where's my phone? Where's my phone, right? And you realize that so much of our lives are bound up in these kind of habitual, distracting activities, where we're just trying to there's something, boredom is just uncomfortable. It's not fun. Ask my kids. If they're bored, there's it's not fun, right? But you need that kind of space to engage in this sort of activity. So for my students, I help them sort of, I walk through and I, hear from them that if you want to develop that, it's a skill. It's a really hard thing to do, right? And they totally realize that. They also, I should say, they are uncomfortable at first with this. But after a half hour, because I have them do this for 45 minutes and then come back, they say after that, and I think you've experienced this, you can just breathe in a way. You just and a lot of students they come back and they're like, why am I doing so much? Why am I in 9 classes and 100 clubs and all these things? There's what's going on, right? And there's just a space that's created there. Just the space, again, after I do some mindfulness meditation, or if I take a hike in nature or something like that, there's just a, I think that's an awareness of that kind of space. And attempt to create it. Yeah.
I think you've omitted a discussion of the word sin. And that makes us uncomfortable. And when I first began going to church, I had a college professor, and he described my cross as a cross of gold because I was grateful for everything.
Yeah.
But then as I matured, I found out I wasn't always good. I committed sin.
Yeah.
And so that required a concentration of a deeper nature
Yeah.
into how do we get forgiveness of our sins.
Yeah.
And that required me to, at one point, accept God's grace.
Yeah.
And then I could forgive myself and
Yeah.
live a more joyful life.
Yeah.
But I could also forgive others. Until you forgive yourself and
Yeah.
have God's grace, I don't think you can accept
Yeah.
a fully fulfilled spiritual life.
Yeah. So I think that's great. And a couple things to note about this. One, the Greek term for sin, and I'm not going to be able to give you the etymology of all these things, but trust me, comes from a term that means to miss the mark, which is a very virtue ethical sort of idea, right? And when we sin, and this is something that even Aristotle would say, he wouldn't say sin, but he would say when we fall short of the mean, the thing that we're aiming at, it's often because we want the good thing, but we've either got some wrong idea about it, or we're weak and we're just I know I should eat broccoli, but Cheetos, So we want to do it, but we miss the mark, right? So it's a failure to sort of do the right thing at the right time in the right way with the right motivations, right? And so sin can be very easily represented in a virtue ethical framework because it is our falling short of achieving the virtues or engaging in the kind of activity that would give us the virtues, right? And Aristotle calls these vices, right? So I think that's really important, right? Sin is going to be sort of constantly a temptation that holds us back from acquiring these virtues like compassion, forgiveness for yourself, forgiveness for others, etc. Another thing that I think is really important to note here is that for Aquinas, say, he takes a lot of Aristotle's system, but he says, look, a lot of this is great, but you're missing the fact, and this goes back to the Holy Spirit question as well, you're missing the fact that it's not all just about us. There's this whole other layer here, right? We are fallen creatures, and so we can't become completely happy on our own. Aristotle thought you could pretty much do it by yourself. And Aquinas says, no way, you definitely cannot, right? It requires something else, something like grace, right? And it's not something you can achieve in this lifetime. So for Aquinas, so Aristotle says you can become eudaimon, you can become happy, deeply happy, but only at the end of your life. It's going to be really difficult, only for a little time, okay? And Aquinas says, no, you're never going to be there until you get to heaven, right? Because heaven is sort of beatitude. It is the completion or the perfection. And that's something that we can't do by ourselves, right? Something that you're going to need grace for. That's really important, yeah. Yeah, toward the back, and then Mary.
Sometimes I think the word contemplation, it sounds so rather esoteric and can be intimidating.
Yeah.
And people can sometimes equate it with, well, you have to be a mystic or
Yeah.
a monk or something of that nature. And there's a simplicity. You know, sometimes things can, analysis can lead to paralysis.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, I know. Yeah, yeah.
That I've always liked the story about the little boy who would wander off behind the house into the woods. And his father began to notice that and become a bit concerned. Why is he going there? So one day he had a talk with the boy and he said, I noticed that, very often you'll wander into the woods by yourself. Why are you doing that? And he said, to be with God, well, the father said, you don't need to go there. God is always with you, no matter where you are. And the boy said, I know that, but I'm not always with God. Talk about
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
here was contemplation
Yeah.
in this.
Yeah. I think that's beautiful. And I think one thing, especially in the sort of religious tradition that I'm familiar with, just like broadly like the Christian tradition, the Catholic intellectual tradition, I think even somebody like Aquinas, right, who theorized all the time, was just like always analyzing, thinking about these things, making distinctions, doing philosophy. I think there's a recognition that this sort of activity has a simplicity to it. There's some saints that are deeply contemplative, and it seems like it comes not from a place of scholarship and study. It's just either an attunement to the world or sort of acting in the world in a certain way, practicing love and gratitude. And so I think that's definitely right. I think it's possible to become contemplative without becoming deeply philosophical. I think one thing that's great about philosophy is it's a way of painting a picture and sort of helping redirect our lives. And it's also, so for me, constantly like just walking through life thinking like, man, I thought if I had this one thing, I'd be so happy. I'm not happy. Why not? And philosophy is one thing that you can do to think systematically about good things in your life and how they should be structured and arranged. But I also think it's not an essential thing. Man, don't tell the philosophy department I said that. I really don't think. So I certainly think that's right. You could be contemplative without the sort of philosophical part. Mary, you had a question?
So
Yeah.
if I were 18
Yeah.
in your class, I wouldn't have a lot of experience and maybe wisdom to bring to it, but I'd have a lot of time to figure it out.
Yeah.
So now I have the wisdom maybe and
Yeah.
experience, but I don't have a lot of time to figure it out.
Sure.
So
Sure.
what do I do?
Yeah.
If, I should have this quote
Sure.
into my life
Yeah.
a long time ago.
Yeah.
So is it too late or is it not too late? Well, I about that.
Great. So the question is it too late? Like if you've already sort of lived much of your life, you've had a lot of experiences, is it too late to start thinking about this stuff and start using it and incorporating it and integrating it in your life? Great news, no. Because one fun fact that I like to point to is Aristotle actually didn't allow 20-year-olds into his classes because he thought the most important sort of moral reasoning and ethics that you can do is not this theoretical stuff, right? It's not learning logic and then figuring out like all the distinctions and all this kind of stuff. I think that's important in some respects, but the most sort of necessary thing in order to actually engage in moral reasoning is having life experiences. And so until you're 40, 50, 60 years old, you are not in a position to actually reason deeply and acquire this kind of wisdom. So for Aristotle, if you start too young, you're actually likely to mislead yourself. You're likely to think like, well, I know things. And so like, here's the moral distinctions, like this is how I should live. And he thinks that can be a disaster, right? Whereas if you actually have the life experiences, that's the sort of stuff that wisdom is made of, right? So that's good news. That's what Aristotle, sort of the way he thinks about it. I'll mention in the classes that I teach, there's a program at Notre Dame. It's called the Inspired Leadership Initiative. And it's for people who are retirement age. They're sort of at the end of their career, or they're at a pivot point in their career. And they come back for a year, and they spend the whole year on campus taking classes. They take classes, so I teach one of those classes, which is so intimidating. You guys, I come in, and there are just these incredible people who have had incredible lives, and I'm like, I'm going to teach you something. I'm just like, what do you. But I come in, and some of the classes are part undergraduate and part Inspired Leadership Fellows, and one of the classes I teach is on the philosophy of work, and it is just incredible to watch the difference in the way that the students will read about leisure or contemplation and the way that the Inspired Leadership Fellows will read about it and think about it. And then I mix them all up and have them talk about it together. And they all come out with these different insights, right? They all come out thinking differently than they did coming in. So I would say, yeah, it's just one of the most magical sort of processes to watch, right? To see somebody taking these ideas, thinking about them, applying them to life, and then working through, the material that we're doing and talking and dialoguing with each other. Do we have, oh my goodness, it's 5:20. You guys, I am so sorry. I'm gonna hang out. So if anybody wants to talk or chat, feel free to come up, but I should let you go. Thank you so much.